What happens when the voice you trusted all your life suddenly grows quiet? Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence that feels like distance. Before there was doubt, before the long nights of questioning, there was a man whose faith burned like an unbroken flame. He was not born into greatness. He was not crowned by kings. He was chosen in obscurity, a voice rising from dust to speak words that carried the weight of heaven. He did not ask to be a prophet, and perhaps that was why he was chosen. In the ancient days, when cities trembled under the shadow of unseen judgment, the heavens seemed close enough to touch. Every storm felt like a message, every sunrise like a promise. And among the countless souls who walked beneath that sky, one man stood apart, not because of power, but because he listened. His name is forgotten by many. History remembers miracles. It rarely remembers the loneliness behind them. He walked alone through crowded streets, carrying words that were never truly his own. When he spoke, people felt something ancient stir within them. Fear, hope, repentance, wonder. But prophecy is not glory, it is burden. Imagine knowing truths that others cannot see. Imagine feeling the weight of a voice that demands obedience even when the world turns away. He stood before kings who laughed at him, before crowds who doubted him, before friends who abandoned him. Yet through it all, one certainty remained: God answered him, not always with thunder, not always with fire, sometimes only a whisper, quiet enough that only he could hear. And that whisper sustained him until the day it stopped. At first, he did not notice. Silence can be gentle when it arrives slowly. A prayer unanswered here, a vision delayed there. He told himself it was a test. Faith, after all, was never meant to be easy. So he waited, he fasted, he knelt on cold stone until his knees grew numb. He searched the ancient words, tracing the promises with shaking hands. He climbed the same hills where he had once heard heaven speak, stood beneath the same sky that had once opened to him like a door, and he listened. Nothing, only the wind moving through dry grass, only the distant echo of city life, indifferent and unbroken, only time passing with quiet cruelty. He told himself it would return. The voice had never failed him before. God was not a man to forget, but days turned to weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the silence remained. It did something to him slowly, invisibly, the way water reshapes stone. It began to hollow out the certainty he had once carried like armor. The people still came to him. They brought their sick, their dying, their questions, their guilt, their fear. They wanted a sign. They wanted reassurance. They wanted him to speak with the authority he once had, and he wanted to. He wanted to open his mouth and feel the old fire return. He wanted to say, "Thus says the Lord," and know it was true not because he needed the phrase, but because he needed the presence behind it. But his mouth felt dry. His words felt thin, and for the first time, he feared he might be speaking only to fill a void. Have you ever spoken into a silence so vast that your own voice begins to sound like doubt? He began to walk at night, when the streets were empty and the darkness made it easier to be honest. He wandered past sleeping homes, past shuttered markets, past temples where lamps burned low. He listened for anything that felt like direction, and he found only himself. The mind is not gentle to a man who has lost his anchor. In the beginning, he searched for reasons. Perhaps he had sinned. Perhaps he had grown proud. Perhaps the voice had withdrawn to teach him humility. He replayed every day, every thought, every private moment he could barely name. He became suspicious of his own heart. He watched himself the way a judge watches a guilty man, but the silence did not lift. Then his suspicion turned outward. Perhaps God was angry with the people and had withdrawn from all of them. Perhaps judgment had already begun, and the first sign was not fire from heaven, but absence. But what kind of judgment looks like quiet? The silence did not answer that either, and so another thought began to form, slow and dangerous, like a shadow lengthening at sunset. What if it was not a test? What if the voice was gone? It was a thought he would not dare say aloud, not in public, not to the faithful, not even in prayer, because to speak it felt like an act of betrayal, yet it returned again and again, uninvited. What if the heavens had never been as close as he believed? What if he had mistaken his own intensity for divine presence? The thought struck him with terror because it did not only question his calling, it questioned his entire life. Without the voice, who was he? A man who had disrupted cities, a man who had spoken against kings, a man who had burned bridges and lost friends and watched people turn away, a man who had chosen loneliness because obedience demanded it. If he was wrong, then he had sacrificed everything for an echo. It was not merely doubt, it was grief, because doubt is not always disbelief. Sometimes doubt is the mind's way of mourning the certainty it once held. One evening, he returned to a place he had not visited in years, a ruined temple, half collapsed, forgotten by the priests who preferred polished stones and predictable rituals. The air smelled of dust and old incense. He stepped over broken pillars and cracked tiles. His footsteps sounded too loud in the empty space. The roof above was split open, so the last light of day spilled in like a wound. He fell to his knees, not in performance, not for the eyes of others. There was no audience here, only silence. He spoke anyway, quietly at first, then with growing urgency, as though volume could reach what distance had swallowed. I waited, he whispered. I listened. I obeyed. The words felt thin in the air. Where are you? His throat tightened. His hands trembled. I carried your words like fire. I stood in the path of anger and did not move. I lost everything that was mine because you asked it of me. Oh, he swallowed. And now? Nothing. He hated how human it sounded. How small. He wanted to sound like a prophet. He wanted to sound like faith. But faith, without response, begins to sound like pleading. You chose me, he said, and his voice cracked on the last syllable. Why would you choose me if you would leave me alone? The sentence hung in the dark like smoke. He waited. Nothing. There is a peculiar violence in unanswered prayer, not because God owes anyone a reply, but because silence forces the heart to reveal what it truly worships. The prophet had always believed he worshipped God, but in that moment he began to fear he had been worshiping certainty. When certainty dies, something else rises in its place. Anger, not the loud kind, not rage that throws stones, a quieter, colder anger, like ice forming in the soul. He rose and left the ruined temple with a heavy step. The city lights in the distance flickered like indifferent stars. He walked until his feet hurt, then walked farther. He began to avoid people, not because he hated them, but because their expectations pressed against him like a weight. When they looked at him, they did not see a man. They saw a channel, a conduit, a promise that heaven still spoke. And he was terrified they would discover he no longer heard anything. He began to question the very nature of calling. Had he been chosen because he was special, or because he was convenient? Was he replaceable? Was he merely one voice among many, easily silenced and forgotten? In his loneliness, he started to envy ordinary men. Ordinary men could live without certainty. They could love without prophecy. They could build homes and raise children and laugh at festivals and sleep at night without feeling the weight of eternity pressing on their chest. He had none of that. His life had been a narrow road, and now the road had disappeared into fog. And still, he could not simply stop believing. That is the cruel paradox of real faith. People imagine faith as a shield against pain. Often, it is the very thing that makes pain sharper, because if God is real, silence has meaning, and meaning is heavy. He tried to force himself into submission. He tried to repeat the old words, the old prayers, the old hymns. He tried to become smaller in the hope that humility would reopen the heavens. But something stubborn inside him refused to be soothed by ritual. A question had taken root, and it would not be uprooted by repetition. The question was simple. Why? Why would the God who speaks choose to be silent? Why would the God who calls refuse to answer? Why would the God who demands obedience allow the obedient to wander in darkness? The prophet had spent years telling others to obey without seeing. He had demanded trust from the trembling. He had asked them to endure. Now the demand returned to him like a knife turned inward. Obey without seeing, trust without hearing, endure without comfort. He found he did not like the taste of his own message, so he argued, not because he wanted to rebel, but because something in him needed honesty more than peace. He began to speak to God as a man speaks to a father who has locked the door. You warned me about pride, he said one night, staring into the darkness of his own room. But is it pride to ask for your presence? Is it pride to want to know you are still there? He paused, waiting for the voice. Nothing. Another night, you told me the people were stubborn. You told me they were blind. But what am I supposed to do when I feel the same? When I cannot see your hand, cannot hear your words, cannot sense your breath? Nothing. The silence became an opponent, not a demon, not an enemy with a face, but a vast pressure against his soul. And slowly, the prophet realized what the silence was doing. It was stripping him, not of faith, of illusions. It was removing the idea that prophecy made him important. It was removing the idea that being chosen meant being protected. It was removing the comfort he had confused with God's presence. It was forcing him to stand with nothing but his own naked heart. And in that place, the heart tells the truth. He did not only want to serve, he wanted to be seen serving. He did not only want to obey, he wanted obedience to be rewarded. He did not only want God, he wanted God to be predictable. And that is what broke him. Because God is not a machine. He is not a pattern. He is not a predictable flame you can summon by saying the right words. The prophet had known this in theory. Now he was learning it in reality, and reality is crueler than theory. One morning, he woke before dawn with a weight on his chest, as though someone had placed a stone inside him. He walked outside and watched the sky begin to lighten. The world looked the same. The birds still moved. The wind still breathed. Yet everything felt different. He realized, with a chill, that life could continue without his certainty. The universe did not pause when he doubted. The sun did not stop rising. The silence did not tremble at his pain. And something in that realization almost broke him completely, because it meant his suffering did not control the world. He was not the center. He never was. That should have humbled him. Instead, it frightened him. He returned to the ruined temple. This time, he did not begin with praise or confession. He began with truth. If you are there, he said, voice low, then speak. If you are not, then I have wasted my life. He hated himself for saying it. It sounded like a threat, like arrogance. Who was he to demand anything? But the words were already spoken, and the silence was already there. He stared at the cracked stones until his eyes burned. He felt the cold seep into his bones. He waited until the light from the broken roof shifted across the floor. Nothing. Then he whispered, almost too softly to hear, I don't know how to be your prophet without your voice. It was the most honest sentence he had ever spoken, and it opened something in him, not an answer, a doorway, because in that moment he understood the core of his struggle. He was not merely missing God, he was missing the feeling of God, and feelings are not the same as presence. The prophet had been measuring the Almighty by the sensation of being inspired. He had been measuring truth by the warmth of certainty. Now, he was being asked to measure differently, not by sensation, by faith. That is where the argument truly began. Because faith without sensation feels like walking in a room with no light, reaching forward, trusting the floor will still be there. It is possible, but it costs something. And the prophet, exhausted, wondered if he had anything left to pay. He did not sleep well after that. In his dreams, he stood again in the moments that had once defined him. He saw himself younger, voice louder, eyes bright with certainty. He saw crowds gathering as if pulled by an invisible force. He saw kings stiffen when he spoke, priests falter, merchants pause mid-sentence, as though the air itself had become heavy with meaning. He remembered the first time the voice had come to him, not as poetry, not as imagination, as something real sharp, unmistakable, cutting through him like a blade of light. He had been frightened then, not because it sounded angry, but because it sounded absolute, as though a truth older than the world had taken his name into its mouth. He had fallen to his knees without thinking. He had said yes without fully understanding what yes would cost. Now, years later, he wondered if that first moment had ruined him, not because God had harmed him, but because once a man has tasted absolute certainty, ordinary life becomes unbearable. Certainty is intoxicating, and like all intoxicating things, it demands more. The prophet wondered if his argument was actually withdrawal, if the silence had forced him to confront a dependency he had never admitted. What if he had become addicted to revelation? What if the voice had become a reward, a spiritual substance he needed to feel alive? It was a shameful thought. He had always imagined pride as arrogance, as boasting, as domination. He had never considered that pride could hide inside spiritual hunger. But hunger can be proud too, because hunger demands, hunger insists, hunger believes it deserves to be fed. So the prophet began to ask a different question, not, why are you silent? But why can't I endure your silence? That question was sharper, more personal, less flattering, and it led him to an even darker place. He realized he had been building his identity on being chosen. Chosen men are admired. Chosen men are feared. Chosen men become symbols, and symbols are rarely allowed to be human. The prophet had carried that symbol until it crushed him. He could not be uncertain. He could not be weak. He could not be confused. He could not admit emptiness, because emptiness, in a prophet, becomes a scandal. So he hid. He hid behind phrases, behind ritual, behind the reputation of past miracles. He told people to trust God, while he privately begged for a sign that God still trusted him, and the silence refused to relieve him, perhaps because relief was not the point. In the days that followed, his arguments grew sharper. He returned to the ruins again, and again, and again, as if the broken stones could witness his pain, and therefore make it real. He spoke into the darkness with a trembling honesty. You gave me words, he said, and those words cost me everything. He remembered nights when he had been hunted, days when he had been mocked, times when he had watched his own people choose comfort over truth. He had endured because he believed the voice was worth it, but now the voice was absent, and the cost remained. Was I only valuable to you when I was useful? He asked. It sounded blasphemous. It sounded like accusation, but the prophet had reached the point where politeness felt like a lie. Do you love me? He whispered. Or do you love what I do? Silence. He clenched his hands until his nails cut skin. He hated the silence. He hated it the way a drowning man hates the water he cannot breathe. Yet he was beginning to suspect the silence was doing something precise, not cruel, surgical. It was cutting away the prophet's belief that he could bargain with obedience. That belief is common, even among the faithful. If I obey, I will be blessed. If I sacrifice, I will be rewarded. If I endure, I will be comforted. If I remain loyal, I will be answered. The prophet had preached against shallow religion, against mechanical rituals, against people who treated God as a tool, yet he had not noticed how subtly he had done the same. Not with sacrifices of animals, with sacrifices of self. He had assumed that giving himself meant being given something in return: presence, clarity, reassurance, the warm light of certainty. Now the silence was destroying that contract, because God does not sign contracts, He calls, he commands, he loves, he remains free. And freedom is terrifying when you cannot control it. The prophet began to understand that his argument was not simply about silence, it was about control. He wanted the voice because the voice meant direction. Direction meant purpose. Purpose meant the pain was not meaningless. Without direction, he was forced to confront a frightening possibility that obedience sometimes feels meaningless from the inside. He knew the doctrines, he knew the promises, he could recite them like scripture carved into stone. But doctrines are easy when you are not in the fire. When you are in the fire, you want a hand on your shoulder, a word, a sign, and when none comes, doctrine feels thin. So he argued again. If you wanted me to trust, he said, why give me a voice at all? Why show me your nearness, only to pull it away? He expected nothing, yet the act of speaking was becoming its own strange form of faith, because even accusation assumes an audience. A man does not argue with emptiness, not for long. One evening, he sat alone on the hill outside the city, watching the lights flicker beneath him like distant embers. The night air was cold, the sky vast. He thought of the people, not as a crowd, as individuals. A widow who had begged him for hope, a young man who had asked whether God could forgive, a father who had brought a sick child and looked at him with trembling expectation. The prophet had spoken boldly to them, but had his boldness actually helped? Or had it simply made him feel powerful? He wondered how many times he had used certainty as a weapon. Certainty can comfort, but certainty can also crush, because when you speak as if you know everything God is doing, you leave no room for the human heart to breathe. He realized, with shame, that he had sometimes enjoyed the weight of authority. A prophet's words can quiet a room. A prophet's gaze can make strong men flinch. A prophet can feel like the mouth of heaven. That feeling is dangerous. It can turn obedience into ego, and perhaps the silence had come to save him from that. The thought angered him at first. Save him? By stripping him? By humiliating him? Yet, slowly, he began to see it. The prophet had been becoming a god in his own eyes. Not openly, not in doctrine, but in practice, because he had begun to trust his role more than the one who gave it. He had begun to trust his ability to speak more than his ability to listen. Now he could not speak with power, and so he was being forced back into listening. But listening without sensation feels like listening into a void. Night after night, he returned to prayer, not with the same words, but with a different posture. He stopped trying to sound holy. He stopped trying to perform faith. He spoke like a man. I am tired, he said. I am afraid. I am angry. Then, after long pauses, he would add, and I am still here. That last sentence became his defiance, not against God, but against despair. Despair says, leave. Despair says, abandon this. Despair says, if you are not answered, you are not loved. The prophet had begun to sense that despair was the true enemy, not doubt. Doubt can be honest. Despair is a conclusion, and conclusions close doors. So he resisted despair by doing the only thing he could do. He remained. He remained in prayer. He remained in obedience. He remained in a faith that no longer felt like fire. It felt like weight. Then, one morning, something changed. Not a vision, not thunder, not an angelic choir, just a subtle shift in the air, as if the silence itself had turned slightly, like a face. The prophet froze. He had felt this before. Not the voice, exactly. The presence, the sensation that he was not alone. It was faint, almost nothing. A man could dismiss it as imagination, but the prophet had lived too long with divine whispers to mistake the shape of it. He breathed slowly, afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would vanish. And then, in the quietest way, words formed inside him, not shouted, not announced, simply placed there, like a stone in the palm. You speak as if I have left. The prophet's eyes filled with tears. He did not respond with praise. He did not respond with gratitude. He responded with truth. I waited. he said. I called. I cried out. Why did you not answer? There was a pause, and then the reply, gentle but piercing. I was not silent. You were listening only for fire. The sentence stunned him because it revealed the heart of everything. He had been trained by miracles to expect intensity. He had been trained by revelation to demand clarity. But heaven does not always speak with intensity. Sometimes it speaks with stillness. Sometimes it speaks by refusing to be manipulated. The prophet lowered his head. You gave me words that shook nations, he said softly. How am I supposed to live on whispers? Another pause. Then, something like compassion wrapped around him, not as a feeling, but as a reality. You have mistaken my presence for a sensation, the voice seemed to say, though not in those exact words. You have mistaken clarity for love. The prophet wanted to argue again. He wanted to say that men die in silence, that cities fall in silence, that fear grows in silence, that obedience without reassurance is too heavy for flesh and bone. But the presence did not invite debate. It invited surrender, not surrender of the mind, surrender of the demand. The prophet realized, with a shiver, that God had not returned to reward him. God had returned to reveal him, to show him what he really sought when he prayed. Not God. Certainty, and certainty is not God. So the prophet did something he had never truly done before. He stopped trying to win. He stopped trying to extract a guarantee. He simply spoke. I don't understand, he whispered, but I will not leave. The presence did not reply immediately, and in that pause, the prophet felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace, not the peace of being answered, the peace of being held. The silence did not disappear after that. The prophet expected it to. He expected the heavens to open the way they once had, with visions and commands and clear steps forward. He expected the return of the old fire. But God did not return to restore the past. God returned to reshape him. The days that followed were strange. The prophet still woke with questions. He still felt the weight of uncertainty. He still listened and sometimes heard nothing. But the nothingness had changed. It no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space, space in which his faith could breathe without turning into demand. He realized the difference between emptiness and stillness. Emptiness is absence. Stillness is presence without noise. And for years, he had confused noise for presence. Now he was learning to recognize presence, even when it did not come with spectacle. That learning was slow. It felt like being retaught how to walk. There were mornings when he rose and felt the old ache return. He would step outside, look at the sky, and feel again the panic of uncertainty. Is it real? Is it gone again? Am I imagining it? But instead of spiraling into despair, he began to speak a new kind of prayer, not a prayer of command, a prayer of honesty. If you are here, he whispered, teach me how to live like you are here. That prayer did not demand a response. And strangely, that made it stronger, because prayer is not a lever, it is a posture. The prophet's argument had not ended because he had been corrected. It ended because he had been seen. The presence had not crushed him for questioning. It had held him through it, and that taught him something terrifying and beautiful. God is not threatened by honest struggle. God is threatened only by false worship. False worship is obedience without love. False worship is ritual without truth. False worship is certainty used to hide fear. The prophet had been worshiping certainty. Now he was being invited to worship God. That invitation changed how he spoke to people. He returned to the city, not with thunder, but with a quieter authority. He noticed the difference immediately. When people asked him for certainty, he did not rush to give it. He listened. When they begged for signs, he did not promise miracles. He gave them something rarer. He gave them permission to be human. A woman approached him one afternoon, face tight with grief. My husband is dead, she said. Where is God? The prophet's old self would have responded with a polished phrase. The new prophet paused. He is here, he said slowly, but not always loud. The woman's eyes narrowed. That is not an answer, she whispered bitterly. No, the prophet replied. It is not the answer you want. It is the answer that keeps you from building a false God. The woman stared at him as though he had insulted her. He did not soften it, because softening truth can become another form of pride. Pride that believes people cannot endure reality. He had learned that endurance is forged, not gifted, and he would not steal that from her. She left, angry. The prophet watched her go, and for a moment he felt the old temptation to chase after her with reassurance, to give her something sweet, but he did not. He understood now that faith is not built on sweetness. Faith is built on truth, and truth sometimes tastes like silence. That night, the prophet returned to prayer with a different kind of gratitude, not gratitude for comfort, gratitude for being stripped, because stripping had saved him from becoming a spiritual tyrant. A tyrant does not always rule with violence. Sometimes he rules with answers. Sometimes he rules with certainty. Sometimes he rules by pretending he knows exactly what God is doing. The prophet had come close to that. Now he had been pulled back. Days became weeks. The prophet's life did not suddenly become easy. He still faced opposition. He still faced loneliness. He still faced the ache of being misunderstood. But he began to realize that loneliness had changed too. It no longer felt like exile. It felt like companionship with a God who is often alone in the hearts of men. The prophet began to understand something else. The silence was not God refusing to answer. It was God refusing to be reduced. Reduced to a tool, reduced to a predictable pattern, reduced to a reward for obedience. That refusal was love, because a God who can be reduced is not God. It is an idol, and idols always destroy their worshippers. They destroy by making promises they cannot keep. They destroy by demanding that human hearts carry divine expectations. The prophet had carried divine expectations. The silence had broken him, so he would stop. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, he sat alone again, not in despair, but in reflection. He thought about the nature of argument. An argument can be rebellion, but it can also be intimacy. A child argues with a stranger only rarely. A child argues with a father because the bond is strong enough to hold tension. Perhaps his argument had been, in its own painful way, proof that he still believed God was there, because to argue with God is still to face him. It is still to turn toward him rather than away. The prophet remembered something he had once spoken to a crowd years earlier. Do not harden your hearts. At the time, he had meant it as a warning against disobedience. Now he understood another meaning. Hardness is not strength. Hardness is refusal. It is the refusal to feel, the refusal to struggle, the refusal to admit vulnerability. His heart had been hard in the wrong way, not against God, but against his own weakness. He had tried to be a prophet without being a man. The silence had forced him back into humanity. And humanity, he realized, is where faith actually lives, not in spectacle, not in constant certainty, in the daily act of choosing to pray when you feel nothing, choosing to obey when you do not see results, choosing to love when love is not rewarded, choosing to remain when leaving would be easier. Faith is not a moment, faith is a posture repeated until it becomes the shape of the soul. The prophet had wanted a dramatic answer. What he received was transformation. He began to see the story differently. He had once believed the greatest spiritual threat was open rebellion. Now he suspected a quieter threat was just as deadly. The quiet threat is the belief that God must always feel near, or else he is absent. That belief creates a fragile faith, a faith dependent on constant emotional reinforcement. Such faith collapses the moment silence arrives. The prophet's faith had nearly collapsed. Now it had been rebuilt on something stronger, not sensation, not certainty. Trust. Trust is heavier than certainty. Because certainty is easy, it removes risk. Trust embraces risk and continues anyway. The prophet's struggle had given him something he did not expect. It had given him compassion, not soft compassion that tells people everything will be fine. Hard compassion. Compassion that recognizes how brutal silence can be. Compassion that does not mock doubt. Compassion that can sit with a suffering soul without needing to fix it immediately. He began to understand that the people who truly suffer are not always those who lose faith. Sometimes they are those who cannot admit struggle because their religion has trained them to perform certainty. Performance is exhausting. Performance breaks men. Silence revealed the prophet's performance and then stripped it away. One night, he returned to the ruined temple one last time. The roof was still broken, the stones still cracked, the air still thick with dust. He stood where he had once fallen in protest, where he had spoken like a drowning man. He looked up at the opening in the roof and saw stars. They were distant, quiet, indifferent, yet they were also steady. He remembered how many times he had looked at stars and demanded meaning, demanded messages. Tonight he did not demand. He simply watched, and in that watching, he felt the presence again, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its quiet reality. He spoke softly. I argued, he said. I accused. I doubted. He swallowed. And you did not destroy me. The silence did not answer with words, but it answered with steadiness. The prophet realized that this steadiness was the answer, not an explanation, an anchoring. Explanations can be argued with. Presence cannot. He bowed his head, not because he had been forced, because he had been held. Then he whispered the sentence that marked the end of his war. I will stop demanding fire. He exhaled. I will learn to live by the whisper. And in that moment, the prophet understood the deepest truth of his own story. The greatest battle is not always in heaven. It is within a man, the battle between pride and humility, between control and surrender, between worship of certainty and worship of God. The prophet had entered the silence, believing silence was punishment. He left the silence, knowing silence can be mercy, because silence exposes what we truly seek. And once exposed, we are given a choice to abandon faith because it no longer feels powerful, or to keep walking because the source of light is real, even when the light is dim. The prophet chose to keep walking, not because he felt strong, but because he finally understood what strength actually is. Strength is not the ability to feel God. Strength is the ability to trust Him when you do not. And perhaps the most dangerous thing a soul can do is confuse God with the feeling of God. Feelings rise and fall like weather. God remains. So when you fall in love with certainty, silence becomes unbearable. But when you fall in love with truth, even silence can become holy. And that is the story of the prophet who argued with God. He did not win the argument, he survived it, and in surviving it, he became something he had never been before. Not merely a voice that spoke for heaven, but a man who could walk with heaven even when heaven was quiet. If you have ever stood in the dark and wondered whether your prayers were heard, you are not alone. The silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means you are being taught how to trust, because the light that is real does not always blaze. Sometimes it whispers, and the soul that learns to follow the whisper becomes stronger than the soul that only follows fire.